Welcome back to the Cloud Native Platforms track here at Spring One. Next up, Dodd Peffer will give us a demo-driven presentation about how to bridge the gap between OpenID Connect and LDAP to secure access to your Kubernetes cluster. His talk is called Demystify LDAP and OIDC, providing security to your app on Kubernetes. Take it away, Dodd.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dodd Peffer, and I'm an advisory solutions engineer with the VMware Tanzu team. As a solutions engineer, I get to spend time with customers at various stages along their modern application journey. But quite commonly, it is in the early stages of evaluating the Tanzu portfolio of products. It is in this stage that customers have a desire to see how the Tanzu products fit within their environment. How can they plug it into their existing ecosystem and see if it really works for them? Doing this time and time again with customers and working with peers to assist them, I've identified that working with enterprise security and directories can be a challenge to various folks within the organization. And particularly because of silos, and it doesn't happen very often, right? And that idea had led me to give a talk here to explain some of the key aspects and tooling that I've used to help customers integrate in with their directory services. All right, as part of doing this, we're going to choose a model application that we want to deploy to Kubernetes, and then we want to see how we've applied the concepts of LDAP and OIDC to it. So without further ado, we'll get started. We're going to set the stage, then we're going to put the pieces together one by one, and I'll show the results. Everything that I share today is going to be GA products. So no concerns here. If you wanted to go ahead and do the same steps that I'm doing, you'd be able to handle that. However, we're required to show this slide. All right, so why does this matter? Why should you be interested in learning a little bit more about LDAP and OIDC? And that's because of these silos that I talked about. And commonly, there's some group that's been around forever in your organization that manages your directory. And if you need to get access, you work with them. There could be a ticketing system that you use to interact with them. And it happens maybe once a year, right? Or maybe not even that often. And then information comes back and forth, and it's just challenging to deal with, right? But with a little bit of added understanding of these concepts and the protocols that are working back and forth, you may be able to get things set up quicker or be able to troubleshoot if you have problems. Yet, you might have a chance to help yourself and do self-service sorts of integrations. So I encourage everybody to put on their, be curious and look at some of this technology in terms of, not just something that somebody else is doing, but what could I learn to help communication back and forth with other teams. The model application we're going to use is the Spring Cloud Gateway Animal Rescue application. If you've been to some of the great talks at this conference associated with Spring Cloud Gateway, you probably would have seen animal rescue as well. This will serve a nice purpose in terms of a microservices application that we want to apply security for. In the scenario that we're working through, our application is a microservices app. We've been doing the development, and it's time to have a more personalized experience for users. So this is the backdrop of Dodd as the development team or the app operator is working under. And I'm working with the solution architect within my enterprise, an enterprise architecture team. And they said, you know what, Dodd, I really want you to look at OpenID Connect, right? This is something that we're seeing is pervasive across the industry now. It's very popular. And we think that this is the best way for you to implement security within your application. That's great. I have some things to learn then. And I do some research and understand that there's this concept of an IDP and an RP, right? We'll get into some more details, but that's the identity provider and relaying party. So I find an sample application out on the internet, and that shows me how I can build my app. Maybe it's a Python-based app or a Go-based app, and hook in with client libraries for OIDC that allow me to do authentication with Google. Why not? They're an IDP. And I start to learn the mechanics of this interaction. The challenges that I'm facing, though, is my application isn't a simple application, and I'm not going to be using Google as the IDP for my application. My organization leverages Active Directory, which doesn't work with IDP out of the box, right? And I don't have a simple application. I have a microservices application. So how can I take the learnings and the suggestions of my enterprise architect and be able to apply that to my application? Well, a time-honored tradition of facade and gateway patterns would be a perfect thing to start to consider. So how can I take a look at leveraging the communications and protocols that I want to use when my system doesn't fit exactly the way the prescribed pattern applies? And in this case, I can leverage two tools here that are fantastic for this purpose. DEX is a CNCF graduated project that provides OIDC federation. DEX has what's called connectors to plug in backends as it offers an OIDC interface. And one of those connectors is an LDAP connector and can use that to access Active Directory. DEX would be running on Kubernetes in this case. On the other side, I have Spring Cloud Gateway. And Spring Cloud Gateway is a fantastic microservices gateway that I can put in front of my microservices application and handle filters for routing different paths to the services within my application, as well as has a component that will allow me to implement cross-cutting concerns like SSO and implement an OIDC authentication flow for my applications. So in this case, I can use these two products to implement a facade pattern around Active Directory and the applications that I want to put in the hands of my users in a secure way. Now, throughout the remainder of the talk, we're going to go through 3 steps. We're going to integrate Active Directory with DEX. And along the way, we're going to explore LDAP and interacting with Active Directory. And I'll show you some tips and tricks that I've learned while implementing and accessing LDAP in configuration scenarios. The next step we're going to do is we're going to deploy a Spring Cloud Gateway, and we're going to set that up with OIDC as a client of DEX. And step 3, we're going to deploy our application, configure routes within that gateway to send traffic to our application and indicate in those routes where we want security to be applied with SSO. Let's get started. Step 1, explore Active Directory and LDAP. So a little bit of information. Active Directory is Microsoft's directory service. It is absolutely pervasive across the enterprise. More than 20 years of history. It's been rock solid. Name me 10 customers and 9 of them are running Active Directory today. Now, in Active Directory, you can store users and groups and manage them, but you can also manage information about distribution groups, devices, printers, all kinds of things. All of these are stored in Active Directory. And you can have client applications that can interact with Active Directory and talk to it in its specific protocol and access methods. However, the industry has developed LDAP as a lightweight directory access protocol, right? This is a open standards-based method to interact with any directory, because as pervasive as Microsoft's Active Directory is, it is not the only directory out there, and each directory implements things a little bit differently. But if they expose an LDAP interface, you can use a client application that can communicate via LDAP to be able to access that directory. And that's both in terms of querying and managing information within the directory. So in our scenario, and we want to set up our application, we've likely reached out to our directory services team and said, listen, we have a new application. We want to integrate with Active Directory. Would you please set us up for access? And so some ServiceNow requests. And at the end of this, we get an email that says, thank you, valued partner, right? Here's the path to Active Directory. And here's a username that you can use for your system to access Active Directory. We'll send you the password in another email because we're quite secure. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out. I've certainly been around organizations and maybe have had these thoughts myself as an enterprise architect when I've had to integrate with a directory service to find out that one of my peer teams already has the right information to connect to Active Directory. So why not use their account in order to do that. Well, that's not a good idea, because as you are starting to configure your system, you're bound to lock out your account, and then you'll have very unhappy peers within your department. In a similar note, when you are setting up and getting your access for your non-production environment, go ahead and request an additional account to be used for your production system, so that when you lock out your non-production account, your production users still have access. So a little tip from the trenches in there. Now, your Active Directory admin is going to be using an Active Directory interface to manage it and create information. In our demo scenario, I have Active Directory here, and you can see it's managing all kinds of things. A little tiny here, but the point is to just give you a quick view. Some are users, some are groups. One's something called lost and found. I'm not even sure what that is. But I've set this up with a set of users and groups that we'll use for our demo, right? And this is a fairly small size directory, as it's a demo application. All right, so this is what your directory service engineers are used to looking with. Now, if you're going to configure some client applications that you want to integrate with, these are examples of some forms you might have to fill out with information about Active Directory. And you could see things like the host name and bind DN and password, right? This is familiar, it came in the email. But then we have base DN for user search, right? And filter and username attributes. For group searching, again, this base domain, DN, filter, and some group attributes. So what do these mean? And we see them pretty consistently. On the left is the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid UI installer. Here's a Harbor Container Registry authentication, similar sort of attributes. And here's some code from the Spring LDAP Getting Started guide. And you can see similar things, base DN, URL, username, password, right? This is what you're used to. So if you're not sure what this is, you could send an email, screenshot, or some documentation to your directory services admin. But I can tell you from experience, that doesn't go very well. They have 50, 100 different customers that they're working in your enterprise, and they don't want to learn the details of your application that you're trying to interact with, right? If you want access to their system, why don't you learn how to use that access so you can appropriately do it, right? So our goal here is, with that little bit of information, we have to explore the Active Directory. We have to learn about it so that we can configure our client appropriately. One of the things to consider is a directory set up as an organizational hierarchy, right? And they have these things called organizational units that are like parent-child relationships or folders. Those organizational units can store things like users or printers, right? And often you want to be able to find out where the organization unit that has your users are, because that's where you want to do searching. And I've seen that Active Directories may have users in multiple OUs because of acquisitions or line of businesses separating their users in different spots. Additionally, you might find that an organization has a user account for standard employee access to the intranet and emails. But if you're a developer or an admin, you may have an entirely separate user account with elevated privileges, and that user account may be stored in a different OU than the standard enterprise user accounts. Likewise, groups are located somewhere in this directory, and they have an OU, and you may need to identify a group that has a particular, maybe admin level access for your system. All right. So these are all different things that we want to learn about the directory, and we were only given 3 pieces of information in that email, but we need to figure out how to, query and learn about the directory in order to complete the configuration. All right. So here's our setup of the things that we have and the things that we need to learn. The user search base DN is the location in the directory that you're going to do all of your searches based off of, right? And the filter is going to be able to narrow your search down so that you're not, when you're trying to log in and find out if your user exists, you don't want to look at printers and you don't want to look at, distribution lists. You only want to be focused on an optimized user search, that login experience fast, right? And then within a given attribute in the directory, what's the attribute that maps to the username you expect your users to provide in the login form? Likewise, for groups, if you want to be able to get group information out, where in the directory structure are you going to find group information? What identifies an entry in the directory as a group and not a printer or a user, right? And then within a given group, which attribute indicates who are the members of that group, right? All key information. Now, because LDAP is an open standard, it needs to be able to comply for any directory service and how that's set up, right? So this mapping is very important. Luckily, there are some tools that can aid the search. Now, I've certainly gone to the Tanzu Kubernetes grid configuration, entered what I thought the information would be, click submit, and then waited to test out to see if things worked, right? And then when they didn't, trying to figure out where to get the right error information so that which parameters did I get wrong. In those cases, the best thing to do is to leverage the tool like LDAP search, and specifically LDAP search, because this is a Unix-based utility that can provide the same protocol type of searching and parameters that the client libraries of whatever application you're configuring are going to be doing and accessing the system. So when you have a failure, you get the error information from the LDAP protocol stack, and then you can continue to iterate until you get it right, and then go back to the client application to complete your configuration. So LDAP search has a handful of configuration options that are very important. I've captured them here. We'll see them in the demo, although there's an exhaustive list of flags that you can use in the utility. When we're interacting with LDAP search, we're going to get responses back in what's called LDIF format. This is an entry that exists within our directory, which could have tens or thousands of entries within them. A couple of key things that I want to point out. DC stands for domain component. This is largely representative of the directory that you're going to be querying. Now, Active Directory may have some complex forests and trees with acquisitions, but that could have happened in the organization. But this is something key. Which domain component are you going to be targeting? Within the domain component are these organizational units, the OUs, and think of these as like a nested directory structure that can contain entries. All right. Now, the DN is a distinguished name. This uniquely identifies a given entry in the directory. You'll see in this DN that we have this long path. Everything to the left of the first entry is a reference to the parent of this entry. So this is the OU. And then there's a set of attributes or an attribute that within that parent domain is at the entry that I'm looking for. So in this case, it's the CN that's being used, and CN stands for common name. If I look at the CN attribute for this entry, it's just a name, a common name. So this should be able to distinguish Naomi from the other entries underneath the OU users, right? Here we have some reference to the groups that this user is a member of, and then we'll hit SAM account name a little later in the demo. So let's jump to it. Okay, what I have here is a little bit of demo magic. What demo magic does for me, it's going to issue the command so I don't have to type, but it's going to be interacting live with the Active Directory instance that I shared with you via our RDP earlier. So we'll first check to see the options available in LDAP search. And you can see that there's quite a few of them depending on your directory and the different ways you want to interact with it, right? But there is really just a handful of ones that I use most commonly, and we'll demonstrate them now. So if I want to do a query and understand kind of what do the entries look like in a directory I'm accessing, let's start with a base DN. Well, first, I'm going to supply the host provided to me in the email, the bind DN, and password. So this is the privileged account I'm using to do my searching. I'm going to specify a base that I'm going to search for. So this is the topmost base in the tree because I'm just specifying the domain component. And then it's a good idea to limit your searches. So here I'm limiting it to 10. You could be working in an enterprise with thousands or millions of records, right? So limit that search and do yourself a favor for the directory services team that needs to, operationally support the environment. Now we get a sense of like, okay, what do these entries look like? I'm starting to see some patterns here. I see the DNs, object classes, and so forth. But I'm really not sure where my users are, right? Like this was somewhat helpful, but not great. Let's first, and what I like to do is go find something you're familiar with, like yourself or a user at the organization that's doing the deployment. Here, we're going to search within the domain component, and we're going to specify the common name, and we'll search for myself, right? So we'll see what I look like, and hopefully the search will come back with a hit. In this case, it did. I got one result. Okay, and I can start to see what a user record looks like. A lot of attributes coming back here, right? I got the distinguished name, right? And I'm starting to see what's happening. But I need to extract data out of this that matches the configuration that's important. So I want to search for what a good base DN is for all the users in my organization. And it looks like that's probably a good base DN, right? Because there's an OU called users. And I've seen OU users, OU global users, and they might actually be multiple locations. But in this case, we know at least my user account is in this OU called users. Likewise, we want to filter. So how do I know what a user record looks like? Object class is a key component of an LDAP entry that you can use to distinguish, right? So object class of user would be something good to filter down on. And lastly, what I want to be able to find is what attribute do I want to use when I log in is. I don't type in .peffer, I type in dpeffer, right? And you'll see this SAM account name commonly in Active Directory. And this dates back to the Windows NT and beyond days in terms of an attribute within the directory. More modern systems have adopted like a more fully qualified user principal name where you can also specify the domain component. But in my system, I want to use the shortened form and I want to map dpeffer to be able to log in. So that's a key attribute that I want to be aware of. Now, how about groups? How can I start with groups? Well, I'm a member of groups and I can see the groups that I'm a member of. So if I want to go see what a group record looks like, I can search using LDAP search for one of these groups. I'm in the platform team and the random group. So let's do another query. This time, we're going to specify the same host, bind DN, and password, but I'm going to look in the OU groups that I pulled out of my user record and look for the common name platform team, because that's how I typically refer to the groups that I'm a member of. And this is a group record, right? This is an entry. Here we do similar things like what is a filter? How can we identify a group versus a printer? How about object class group? Now this seems typical, but I can tell you that this is a convention that Active Directory uses. But if you are accessing, let's say, Jump Cloud or Okta LDAP interfaces, these object classes are a little different and the names are a little different. So it's very important wherever you are integrating with that you can use the same LDAP search tools to start to get a sense of exploring the format of these entries. So now I have a filter. I want to refer to this group as platform team. I could use SAM account name or CN. Both of those attributes appear to be the same. I'll use SAM account name. And then I need the base DN as well, which it looks like the groups are in a reasonably named organizational unit called groups. Now, the last thing I want to point out is what is the attribute within the group record that says who the members of the group are? And here it's called member. Again, different directories are going to call this different things, all right? So this is the information that I've been able to learn because I'm using LDAP search. And by doing the validation of these attributes, I can then go back into something like Tanzu Kubernetes Grid or Harbor or my Spring configuration with confidence, know that I'm supplying the right information, right? And we can see here that I was able to find all of the proper, all of the information that was necessary for my configuration. Now, the next thing I want to do is show how we can set up DEX with that information. Now, I have already deployed DEX by means of deploying Tanzu Kubernetes Grid because it is leveraging DEX under the covers to implement its LDAP access when you want to be able to authenticate to Kubernetes, supplying your username and password. So what we'll do is we will go in and look at the DEX configuration, see that it matches what I provided, and then we'll test a login and see if everything works. So I'm going to use a utility that my friend Mark Fines has really got me excited about, which is K9s as a terminal browser for Kubernetes. In here, I can look at all of the pods that are running in my cluster. Oops. And then I want to limit to my, you know what? I'm in the wrong cluster. So I'm going to change to the right cluster where Dex is deployed. Then I'll look at the pods and I want to go in the system auth namespace. So I can see a Dex pod has been deployed. And the Dex configuration is done via a config map that I can look at and see how Dex is configured. We can see that I'm using an LDAP connector. And here's the information that I collected in the form, the base DN, the username, right? The name attribute, the group, where groups are located, what name attributes, how do you map user or members within a group, right? So all of that's been configured in Dex. Now, I have below here a client that wants to access a Kubernetes cluster that's leveraging an open source project called Pinniped that will delegate into Dex to perform Kubernetes-based authentication. And if I do a kubectl get PO to see all the pods in my animal rescue namespace, the Pinniped is going to launch. And let's see what happened here. There we go. A UI so I can authenticate. And I can go ahead and enter Alana, which is my test user, and password. You see I'm using the short username. And when I authenticate there, I can switch back and see that I'm getting responses that I expected. So I've correctly authenticated into Kubernetes using Dex and the configuration that I shared as it's connected to the Active Directory. All right, the last little bonus demo, not particularly associated to the animal rescue scenario, but this is a getting started guide on LDAP that the Spring team offers. And one of the really exciting things that you can do with this is a project that will embed a in-memory LDAP server and expose that interface out to you. And in that in-memory LDAP server, you can define a set of data that should be contained in the LDAP server. So what I've done is I've taken the completed example of that getting started guide, and I can do a query for my Active Directory. And I found in situations where I might want to set up a demo environment or an integration test environment, I want to be able to have certain users that match different flows in my applications or membership responsibilities. But I can't necessarily do all of that setup and test user data in my production Active Directory. So what can I do? I can mock the Active Directory with this in-memory fake Active Directory, mock LDAP or mock Active Directory, and use the contents that I've retrieved by using LDAP search in terms of hand editing the response is something that looks exactly like my Active Directory, but then I can create the users and groups the way I want to. So the Getting Started guide gives you a sample LDIF that does not match Active Directory. This is a different format of a directory service that you can use to explore LDAP. But if you want it to look like your environment, you would use LDAP search, retrieve results, create an LDAP file with the users and groups that you want them to be with the right attributes. And then you can update the application properties, refer to your LDIF file, set your base DN, turn the validation off because you fundamentally changed the schema that came out of the box. And then you can go ahead and run the application. And you're pretending as if you're Active Directory. So you can set up any of these scenarios that you want, right? And then you can do LDAP search, or your system's off. You can point to localhost and 8389, or you can create a container out of this and deploy it to Kubernetes and point to that app, and it'll pretend to be Active Directory. And you can do searches from it and get the results you expect, right? So this was a nifty tip that I've used in non-production environments so that I had more control over the contents of an environment. But it's because I understood LDAP that I was able to do this sort of thing. All right. Next step is to start taking a look at the Spring Cloud Gateway setup and how it can be a client of Dex for OIDC. So we showed that Pinniped and the Kubernetes API server could be a client of Dex, right? That's how I authorize my access to be able to query what pods were in that namespace. But now I want to set up Spring Cloud Gateway to do that. Couple of brief introductions, lots of information on OpenID Connect at openid.net, right? But this is based off of OAuth. You may have heard OAuth in the past, which is a framework for authorization and authentication. It's a variety of standards, a number of standards, all based off of JSON and HTTP to support web and mobile authorization and authentication. One of the things that is specified in there is a JSON web token. And this is something we'll see a little bit later, but a key aspect of how you can represent a token that contains identity and group information, okay? OIDC is a specification that is built on top of OAuth 2 and provides identity services. It has two key participants. That IDP we saw earlier, the role the DEX is playing, provides authentication as a service, and then the relaying party, the RP, which outsources its auth to the IDP. Some big names are involved in OIDC and providing IDP services out there in the industry, as well as you being able to provide your own via DEX. And the JWT token that we'll see can assert identity and group information in one token. And that's something that the downstream systems or Spring Cloud Gateway wants to do as it tries to understand who the user is. So if you're a client and you want to configure access to OIDC, or you want to be able to get access to DEX, how do you learn about the different aspects of that provider? So similar to what we did with LDAP search, how can you learn about how this particular IDP is implemented? Because there's a standard, but each IDP can apply it slightly different. So there's a discovery URL that you'll see more and more IDPs are offering, which is a path here that you can consistently know is well-known OpenID configuration. I'm going to go to that configuration within my DEX endpoint and see that this indicates the issuer URL, so the IDP URL. Where can you go to send requests for authorizations? Once you have an authorization code, where can you go get the tokens, right? And then what is the URI? This is particularly interesting, that contains public keys that you can use to validate the digital signatures of any tokens, right? So this is like a path towards these well-known endpoints that are useful in communication with an OpenID Connect flow, right? And then what scopes and it's security aspects it supports. So a standard flow we're going to walk through looks pretty busy. I'm going to cut it into two parts here. In this scenario, I'm a user and want to interact with my website, the RP. So I make a request to the RP, and the website validates the current user context, the auth context. In this case, I don't have any because I'm visiting for the first time, right? So the RP says back to the browser, back to the user, go visit the auth provider that I outsource to, give them my client ID, who I am, and tell them when they're all done doing their authentication, go ahead and send them back to this URL at my website, right? So then the browser says, sure, makes a request to the IDP, says, I was told to go here by an RP, and they gave me this client ID and said, when I'm all done authenticating, come back to this URL. Okay. The IDP says this client ID is a list of known clients that I expect, and the URL that I should send the data back to is also in the whitelist of allowed URLs that I'm allowed to send information to, right? Two key pieces. Once it validates that, it'll present a login form for the user to provide credentials. That's what we saw when we did that DEX login form, okay? Now, the user is going to submit the username and password information, and the IDP is going to validate that and determine what groups that member is associated to. Then it's going to say, my job's done. I'm going to redirect to the place that client told me to, and I'm going to give you an auth code, just a small string that indicates the result of the session that we just had. Okay. So then the browser gets that redirect request, sends back to your RP and says, hey, I'm all done with the IDP. Here's the auth token or the auth code that they just sent me. RP says, great. Okay, now I have the auth code. I need to go back to the IDP from the server side and says, I need to know who this person is. All I have is an auth token, right? But who are they? So here's my client ID. Here's a secret that is associated with me and the auth code provided. Can you tell me who they are? The IDP is going to say that's a valid ID and secret. This auth code was something that just happened in the last minute or 2 minutes. Here's the ID token that I'm going to digitally sign that represents the user that authenticated with me, as well as the groups that user belongs to. And here's some sort of expiration date of how long this token's good for. Okay. Now, the reason why the client knows where to call based off of the auth code is because in that JSON that I just shared you, there was a token URI. Now I have this token, but I want to, or the ID token, but I want to validate it. Is this good? Did anything change? Did somebody add some groups in there while it was in transit? Well, I have the public keys from the IDP because I searched and grabbed their public keys. I can go validate that signature and make sure that this is a legitimate token. Once I have that and I can trust it, I'll determine whether or not I want the user to go in and based off of the resource they're looking at and now the groups that I know that they're a member of, I can return the requested information to the browser, right? So that's the OIDC flow. As I'm trying to configure something, I'll be configuring Spring Cloud Gateway. Just like we saw the LDAP configuration, there's a common set of configuration values that any client that is going to interact with an IDP should provide. And this is the Harbor and Tanzu Kubernetes grid forms for providing that information. You can see we have the endpoints, that client ID and secret. And then there's some mapping information because not every ID token from every IDP calls their attributes the same things. Maybe they call something groups or roles or something like that, right? So this is, again, because we're using the standards interface, we need to deal with the mapping. So we'll be going into Spring Cloud Gateway and setting that up as a client. First thing we want to do is go to Dex and tell Dex about Spring Cloud Gateway so that it can now understand that it's going to use the ID gateway and the secret, super secret, right? And here's the URL that I'm allowed to do responses back to. Now Dex is configured. Next step is to tell Spring Cloud Gateway about how it's going to communicate with Dex, right? So we'll set up a secret providing the same information inside of Spring Cloud Gateway's namespace, and then we'll use the CRD for Spring Cloud Gateway, refer or light up the SSO capabilities, refer to the secret that stores this key information, and then also do this mapping, right? Like groups in this token are going to map to what Spring Cloud Gateway calls roles. All right. So let's go ahead and get that set up in action. What I want to do is go into Dex. I'm in the config maps, and I want to add a client into Dex. So right now, Dex only client that will allow communications to is Pinniped. That's the service that my CLI down below was using when I wanted to authenticate for Kubernetes. But I'm now going to add a second configuration, update my YAML to make sure that everything's aligned right, which is now telling Dex about this new client. I'll save that, go to the pod and bounce it so that now Dex can be restarted with the updated configuration in the config map. Then I want to go and create my gateway. My gateway is going to go using the Bear Island cluster. I'm going to create a namespace to put that gateway in. The gateway operator has already been deployed to this cluster. We see that I have a local file that represents the client scope, right? And the ID, all the configuration that it needs. So I'm going to create a Kubernetes secret with the contents of that file. Secret created, that's good. I'm going to share the gateway configuration CRD, Spring Cloud Gateway. I'm giving it a name and the namespace, referring to the secret that I just created in my SSO configuration. This is an optional configuration. And then I know that the token's coming back with something called groups, and I want that to map to something called roles inside of the Spring Cloud Gateway domain language. So we'll go ahead and create that gateway. And we can check on the progress of that over here. Just change my context to the cluster that's running Spring Cloud Gateway. And we can look at Spring Cloud Gateway, right? So it's currently still being created. So the pods that are associated with this are not up and running, but now the status has changed to true and it's created. So I should be all set. And I've just configured Spring Cloud Gateway for OIDC to access DEX inside of my environment. Third step and final step is to deploy the application and set up routes with the SSO configuration in Spring Cloud Gateway to direct traffic to my app. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using the popular animal rescue application that's accessible from the Spring team here, microservices-based application with two services, front end and back end. Front end application, is a static website, while the back end is a Spring Boot Webflux app. In that pattern, they have that sit in front of a gateway that can be configured for OIDC, right, for the enterprise provider. The gateway is being created by the Spring Cloud Gateway operator, which we just saw, and can expose via an ingress for user access. Now, the requirements that I have for here is that I need to be able to allow access to the front end application without any authentication, right? Users should be able to go to the front end app. But if I choose to adopt an animal, or I want to adopt an animal, I need to both authenticate myself and be a member of a group named the Animal Rescues Adopter Group. Okay, so let's see how that works. When we set up configurations in the Spring Cloud Gateway, we have an opportunity to specify the name of our service, the backend service, and then the different routes that this exposes. A few things that are key in the CRD definition of this route config is that if you want to have a particular route require authentication, you indicate SSO enabled equals true. The gateway has to have the SSO configuration as well. You can optionally relay tokens to a downstream service so that that service can know the identity of the user. Not all services are going to need to know that, but if you do, and we will, you would set the token relay to be true, and that's going to be a JWT token. The pass that you're going to send data to, and any filters that would be applied. Here, I'm specifying the role filter and indicating a particular group. So not only do the user need to be authenticated, but they have to be a member of the Animal Rescue Adopters Group. Let's go ahead and do that in action for the remainder of our demo. We're going to show some code here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to swing to a fresh view. First thing I want to share is the config that I've set up for this. A little bit more complex than on the screen, but I have 3 path sets that I've defined, or 3 routes. One is for my backend service. Anybody who wants to search animals, I want them to be able to do that without any concern of authentication, right? But I have another endpoint that's going to allow the front end app to know who a logged in user is. And that's the who am I endpoint. That one, I'm going to need to ensure that the user is logged in and relay the token so the backend service can communicate who that user is. Again, I only want animal rescue adopters. And then to implement that other requirement, in order to do any post, puts, or deletes against my API, I also need a user to be a member of this group. So I'm going to provide the SSO enabled and relay token. Now, once I can apply that configuration, there's another step required, which is mapping a particular configuration to the gateway. So in this case, I'm referring to the gateway I created earlier, and here's the route config that I shared above. I also want to indicate the configuration of my backend service. And here's the reference to the image that I want to run in my deployment. And I'm specifying using Spring Security properties the location of the keys file. We saw this in the well-known discovery API, so that way, when the token's sent to the backend service, it knows that if it wants to digitally verify the signature of the token, it's going to have to pull the public keys from this location in order to validate that signature. And of course, with Spring Security, it's going to do that. But it only has to pull those keys down once, and then it can assert anytime it gets a token that that's a valid resource and it can trust it. All right. I'm going to show a little bit of the code in this application. Just it's a pretty simple Spring configure. Oops, I didn't get that right. Zoom is causing me a little bit of delay. Just got to take my time. Here we go. So as I configure Spring Security, we can see that this is backend is going to be an OAuth2 resource. I'm telling it about JWT, and because I want to be able to pull the username out of the token, I'm going to provide a class that's going to help convert that token and identify what the username is. All right. And I can show what that class looks like. Key points of information here is that when I have the JWT token, I want to see if it has a name attribute. That's what I'll use for the name. Otherwise, I'll use the subject. Name is an optional attribute in a JWT token. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to log every token that comes in. That's because we want to take a look at it. I don't know that that's something that you're going to want to do in your environment, but it's helpful as you're exploring this. Okay, with that bit of information, I'm going to go ahead and deploy the application. I'm going to create a namespace, and then I'm going to deploy the application. All right, I'm using a Carvel tool called CAP. It's very friendly when deploying YAML. It gives you an idea of what's being deployed, and we can see that I have my back-end application and my front-end application. I do want to go ahead and deploy it, and it's going to ensure that it doesn't release back to me until everything's up and running. So this takes about 30 seconds in order to get the back-end up and running, because I'm seeding the database with animals in it, as an in-memory database. And here we go. So now my apps should be up and running with the configuration, both my the configuration of the services and the routes that were defined. I can go ahead and query the first requirement, which is, can I go to the gateway and access the animals endpoint? Sometimes this takes just an extra second. There we go. And this is the response that's going to list all the applications in my, all the animals available for adoption. The last part we're going to do here is take a look at the logs. So I'm going to use another utility that I found helpful, Kale, that's going to say, show me the logs for any pod that's in the deployment animal rescue backend. How that's helpful is because the pod names are going to be, have a GUID at the end, but the deployment name is consistent. Then I'll want to go to my web browser and access the application. And we'll see if the requirements are being met. So I have my front end app. I haven't needed to authenticate. I can see the beautiful animals that are available for adoption, but I can't adopt them. And that's because I have to log in first. and I go ahead and log in, I access a endpoint on the Spring Cloud Gateway that's been configured for SSO enabled. So the gateway is then redirecting me to Dex, where I can provide my username and password for access. Dex is going to send back to the gateway and complete the flow that we just shared. Now we can see in very tiny and hard to see font, Alana is my name, but I'm now able to adopt animals, right? And we can see that that authentication has occurred. Now, because I've been tailing the logs and I chose to show what a JWT token or an ITD token looks like, I can capture that. There's not a lot of great information in here. And what a JWT token has 3 parts. It's base 64 encoded, but a very helpful tool that I've used in various aspects of debugging JWT tokens and trying to understand what's in them is going to jwt.io, where you can paste in an encoded token and it will decode it for you. The header of this token gives information about the encryption that's being done. The payload is the meat here, right? So here's my name, Alana, that's what I saw, right? Here are the groups that I'm a member of. Quite often, if I messed up some of the configuration in LDAP, I would have properly been able to authenticate and I can see my user because I've done the user search, but the groups are not matching and that group element is empty. Then I know that I messed up some configuration earlier, maybe in the way the mapping was done or some other aspect of it. So sometimes it's helpful to get in and see what a token looks like. Inside this token as well, it indicates how long does this token last for? What's the expiration date of the token? And then if I wanted to, I could digitally verify the signature, but I'm going to leave Spring Security to be able to do that on its own. So in review, we've done a nice exploration of seeing how we can apply a facade pattern in Kubernetes with some very helpful projects and applications, Dex and Spring Cloud Gateway, to bring our microservices application to be able to leverage authorization services and being able to do it with a backend service provider, Active Directory, that may not be the most cloud native in terms of offering services to applications, right? So we were able to explore Active Directory, find all the configuration we needed, set up Dex as that OIDC federation provider, really leverage the power of that Spring Cloud Gateway operator to instantiate a gateway and set up routes for my application, and then allow my application to be very simple in terms of what it needs to do, delegating the security configuration to the gateway. And I've been able to, really explore all of this aspects and implement the OIDC patterns that my solution architect had given me in terms of being able to take my application live. So it's been a lot of fun. Hopefully you've learned something. Please roll up your sleeves and volunteer yourself next time that there's an integration opportunity to set something up with your enterprise services. Don't be scared to use tools to be able to explore. And when you communicate amongst the various members of the teams, you know these protocols or the concepts of what these other engineers and admins may be used to as you're communicating. Please join me in the Q&A Zoom. I'd love to hear any questions or feedback with you, and I've really had a blast. Thank you.
Thank you, Dodd. I really appreciate being able to see the end-to-end flow, taking us all the way to enabling single sign-on for security-enabled Spring Boot apps. If you have any questions for Dodd, please click the Slack link in the Now Playing tile on this web page. And from the Slack channel, you can find a Zoom link to this presentation's Q&A session.